大家好, kumusta? My name is Victor, and today's video we're going to talk about compressed highlights. Now, this is where we squeeze out the best exposure from your footage by compressing the highlights and kind of just maximizing the camera's dynamic range in post. Now, we're mainly going to use curves. This is essentially going to make your footage give that extra smoothness, especially balancing out hard light and ambient light. Note that we're going to use DaVinci Resolve in this tutorial, but it's also applicable to Premiere Pro, After Effects, Final Cut Pro, and any other editing software that you can manipulate exposure using curves. So let's get into DaVinci Resolve. Let's look at some movies and commercial screen grabs from FrameSet and see how they finish the exposure on the final look. All right, so I have some shots here from The Joker, Midsummer, some commercials, and we're just gonna take a look at the exposure. We're gonna focus here on the scopes and the parades, and as you can see, it's hovering over from 750 to 900, which is the brightest part. It's his green hair. And if we look at the highlights, and we'll just create a power window, you can tell where the brightest part of the image is. So from here, we can see that the green is the brightest part of the image. Next to it is his forehead, and it's reflecting it into the scopes. Notice that the brightest part of the image isn't actually almost clipping. It's this is a Hollywood movie, so this is well exposed. We can also see here that the brightest part of the image is just hovering over 900. This is kind of what I figured out like while analyzing other frames, like actual commercials and movies. And same with this, it's a broad daylight shot, and they were able to keep it under 900. Same with this one too. As you can see, it's the same thing. The highlights and the dynamic range is getting compressed to the Rec 709. They're trying to make it look the best on Rec 709 by utilizing all the dynamic range in terms of highlights and shadows. Same with this one. This is probably around 900, and what we can see that's close to 1,000 is probably the shirt. As you can see, if we focus on the shirt, it's showing up. If we focus on his face, it's around 750 to 900. The brightest part of the image would be his hair, and we can see that go down on the scopes if we try to get rid of it from the power window. So I have put all the CSTs on here. These are all S-Log3 files from the A7C2. What we have here are sample files from the Sony A7C2. I shot everything in S-Log3, and I always do with these new Sony cameras now. As we can see, this is already pretty good in terms of the exposure. I usually expose at +1 so that I get kind of most of the dynamic range on the highlights and kind of save a little bit of that shadow as well. So it's not like crushing the dynamic range of the highlights. That's just what I focus on. But let's go to curves. All right, I'm going to explain a little bit of the curve tool. This is your highlight point. This area right here is your whites and your highlights. This right here is the mids. So if we kind of bring this down, you can see all the highlights and the whites are going down. And then for here, all the mids, it's also affecting these two, because as you can see, the graph, the line is affecting all of them. But we can kind of manipulate that with a few points. But then down here is your blacks and your shadows. If we lift this up, the blacks go up as well, and then the shadow area goes up. And what we can do is kind of like drag this down. But if we want more control, the first thing that we want to do is click on this 3 dots and turn on editable splines. When we click one of the points, it'll have one anchor right here. And in this way, we can bend the curve however we want. And then the other point also has this, and we can have this kind of S-curve. Let's do an S-curve right now, right here, to up the contrast. And then if we want lower contrast, we're going to do a reverse S-curve. All right. Now we're just going to reset the node again. Let me show you guys, if we bring this down, you can see that the highlights go down, right? And at the same time, it's lowering the overall exposure. Now, when I bring this down, the highlights, we're compressing the highlights. And if we kind of look at the overall image, turn it off, the H is a little bit overexposed. Now you can mask this, but I'm also thinking that this one, I need to balance out the ambient and the hard light. So if I turn on the node again, it brings down the overall exposure, but now we can see that the hard light is softer. And then since it's darker in exposure, I'm going to use this anchor tool and I'm just going to lift it up and make sure to kind of have it parallel to this line. Now the overall image is kind of like contrasty now. We're back to kind of where we started, but now it's overexposed. It's because this one is way too long. If we push it to the left, what happens is that the contrast goes higher in terms of the highlights. Now, since we compressed it down, we can kind of manage our highlights here. If we turn on and off, you don't really see a lot of difference, but you can see the scopes being compressed. The top layer, the hottest part of the image is going down, but the mids is also going up. So if we kind of force this down right here, we can see that the overall image again goes down, but then I want to lift the mids by moving this anchor point to the left. Okay, and then if we go down, that should be it. Perfect. So this is off and this is on. What's happening is that I'm just softening the hard light, which is kind of good because it kind of looks like it's, you know, balanced out, especially because this is a run and gun shoot. I had no control over the lights. This is way too bright in my opinion. Obviously, this is probably overexposed. This might be overexposed, but let's see what we can do. I'm just going to drag this to make everything kind of flatter. So yeah, these are overexposed, but once we lift this up and bring this down just a little bit more, it kind of just balances the image and it hides that hard light. This is before, this is after, this is before, this is after. It just makes the image a little bit more pleasing. And then I'm just going to lift up the blacks just a tiny bit and lift that up. And then from here on, we can just add a LUT if we really wanted to. That's way too much. So I'm going to make it like 40%, 50%. Perfect. And that's it. Now let's go here. We can see there's a little bit of a hard light over here. This is right here. The phone is probably overexposed. If we bring that down, we're not retaining anything. So I'll put it here and we'll bring this back again. Compress it a little bit more. Bring this back. Before, after, before, after, before, after. And then we'll lift up the shadows just a tiny bit. Crush it just a tiny bit as well, so nothing is peaking. I find it's a little too dark, so we're just gonna lift the mids by pushing this anchor to the left. You can see that the highlights outside on his face are getting smoother and it's more balanced. And from here, actually, you can mask out the face and you can make it brighter. And then again, if we want to put the LUT on there at 50%, 0.5, we're practically almost done this footage. I really want to make sure that this white is tamed. Yeah, that's good. And then we don't really need to bring up the shadows. We can bring it just a tiny bit, but that's it. And then this guy just needs to go up a little bit. Perfect. Now you can see that the sky, this part of the phone is balanced out. My skin tone looks right. And it's not like glaring hard light. Okay, perfect. This is another great example because this is like a high contrast scene where we can drag the highlights all the way to where we can kind of see the details. Now it's okay for it to be a little bit brighter because that's what we see. But if we want to kind of balance out the image, this is what I would do. And then lift the shadows just a tiny bit and get that exposure in. So we can maximize, again, the dynamic range of this camera. Okay, I like that. But now we're just going to bring this down. That's good. And then maybe get some more of the shadow so we can up kind of like the ambient light to fill. So this is before and this is after. Before and after. And if we look at the scopes, that we're compressing it down to the middle. And to me, it's just a lot smoother, a lot softer, and I really like how it turns out. Okay, so this one, again, we have a high contrast scene coming in. We're just gonna bring this down again. That's good. I don't really need to bring it down that much. Maybe I do. Yeah, we'll bring up the ambient exposure. Same thing here. And then I'm just gonna add a little bit more contrast to this one. And then bring this down. Perfect. That's way too much. Pull this to the left. And then if we start compressing it, we get a little bit more of the detail back and it's a lot softer. Now, again, use this to your advantage. If you want something striking, leave it as is. If you want something softer, you can use this technique. All right, let's move on to a talking head shot. This is like without any grades, just a CST. Again, I'm just gonna bring this down, up. That's good. And then I'm just gonna lift up the shadows just a tiny bit. That's perfect. And you see how the overall look is not contrasty anymore and that it kind of just balances out the image. This is what I would do. Mind you though, if you bring the highlights down, you also lose a little bit of the saturation. This is before, this is after, and I'm okay with that. I can always add the saturation afterwards. This is so that I have also a great flatter image to work with, and I can start playing with the grade after this. A few more couple shots. This is after, this is before, this is after, this is before, this is after. And then on this one, it just makes hard light. This was shot around 1 p.m. So it just makes the hard light, the high noon light, a little softer. Same with this guy. If we do the compressed highlight, you can see what it's doing under the scopes. And if we play it, it's just a little more pleasing to the eyes. It's very similar to this and to this. We know it's a bright image, but it's really just trying to compress it down so that it's not so bright and everything else is well thought out and it's well balanced. I think that's it. Hopefully this was helpful and that, just a little bit of edits go a long way, and hopefully this helps you out in your next videos. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below or message me on Instagram. But until then, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.